I was asked recently, why Amos? Like why that particular book? And as I was answering that question, I realized I do think the answer to that question is really a great place to just start this series in the answer to that question. And so let me put it like this. As I was wrapping up seminary last spring, May of 25, one of my last courses I took was an Old Testament course that focused heavily on the Old Testament prophets, the major prophets, the minor prophets, some other stuff too, but mainly the prophets. And as I was walking through that course, what it did, I'll start here, is I'll just say it kind of whet my appetite for the prophets. And I was aware, and I was already thinking to myself, like, I wanted to go back and look at the prophets again anyway. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when we are looking for books of the Bible to study, for some reason, I feel like those prophets, they're the ones we're most likely to gloss over and skip over, and they don't really get all the love they deserve. So I already kind of had this urge to go look at the prophets, and then that class just kind of whet my appetite for it. And so after the class was over, and the next time I found myself ready to begin a new book study in my own personal study time, I said, you know what? I'm going to go find a prophet to read. And not just any prophet. I wanted to read one of the minor prophets specifically, because if the prophets are the ones we're most likely to gloss over, the minor prophets are the ones that we're more likely to gloss over the major prophets. And if any of that terminology is confusing to anybody, let me just put it like this. In the Old Testament, there are 17 books that we refer to as the prophets. Today, that we refer to as the prophets. There's multiple prophets in the Old Testament, but not all of them have a book named after them. The ones who actually wrote books, and we have those books in our Old Testament, we call those the writing prophets because they're the ones that wrote books. And of those writing prophets, there are 17 of them, 5 what we call major prophets, and 12 what we call minor prophets. The difference has absolutely nothing to do with how important they are. The major prophets are not major because they are, more important or anything like that. It literally just has to do with how long the books are. So the 5 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, they're much longer books than the minor prophets. The minor prophets tend to just be a few chapters each. And so we give a lot of attention, when we do give attention to the prophets, to the major ones. Isaiah, we love to quote Isaiah, especially Jesus in the New Testament and things like that. But the minor prophets, they don't get a whole lot of love. So I said, I'm going to do a minor prophet. And where do I start? Well, I wanted to start chronologically with the order that they actually preached. And for us, that's Amos. Amos was the first of all of those prophets to start a prophesying ministry. Amos was the very first one chronologically to come on the scene. And so I'm going to start with Amos. So I'm like, okay, great. So I start studying Amos in my personal Bible study time, which, by the way, I hope everybody in here has a personal Bible study time. I hope everybody in here is spending time daily in the Word. You absolutely need that to grow. Please be doing that and just be intentional about it. But I was looking for a book to study, and so when I settled on Amos and I started studying through Amos, just a whole bunch of things immediately started grabbing my attention. A whole bunch of things just started popping out at me. And the first of which was, and keep in mind, this was right as we were preaching through the Gospel of John together on Sunday mornings, as we were going through the Gospel of John. This was right around the time that we first started seeing Jesus really running into issues with the religious leaders. You remember that they kept clashing with each other. And if you remember, the number one beef that Jesus had with those Pharisees was their empty religion. Remember, it was always how they were always like, they would show up, they would do all the things you would expect a religious person to do. They went through all the motions, they did all the things, they put on a big show for everybody. But remember, their personal lives and their religious lives were very, very much not in tune with each other. And if you remember, that was what Jesus kept calling out to them. He kept telling them things like, you honor God with your actions or with your motions, but your hearts are far away from God. And so that was like a common beef that he had with them. Well, do you want to wager a guess What's one of the number one accusations that the prophets are making against the people of Israel, over and over and over again in all the prophets? Empty religion. The exact same thing. The exact same thing. Lest you think that this was something that was new in Jesus' day. It was not. It was not. As long as there have been people of God, there have been people of God who have fallen astray in their hearts and have failed to honor God, with their hearts, and have basically just been going through the motions. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. We see it throughout the days of Jesus. And we see it today. We see it today. Today there are people all across, the world really, but especially I would say in the American, in the West, in the Westernized church, there are people who will just go about their lives on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Yes, I know all the days of the week. Saturday. And they will just live their lives doing the things they want to do, making the plans they want to make, just making their own decisions without even a thought about what can I be doing to serve God or honor God today. They will just do their own thing. But then Sunday rolls around and they roll up in the church with a big smile on their face and this big facade in front of them. And either unconsciously or sometimes maybe even consciously, they think that rolling up in the church on Sunday morning cancels out everything else they've been doing just because they showed up. What we're going to see in the book of Amos is that not only does it not cancel out, if anything, it makes it worse. If anything, it makes it worse. Amos is going to really launch into some things about that type of mentality. But this is just one element that jumped out at me. There was a whole second one that really jumped out at me. And to understand what it was, I'm going to have to comment just very briefly on you really have to kind of understand what was going on in Israel at the time Amos is preaching. You really need to understand this. And this is just something, it's true of the whole Bible, but when you're reading the prophets, you really need to kind of understand the what's going on behind the scenes that they're speaking into. It makes it make so much more sense. It makes it make so much more sense. So Amos is preaching at a time, and I'll go more into this in a little while, but I'm going to make the argument he's preaching around 763 BC. That's the argument I'm going to make. And this is a period of time in Israel's history where all the big players in the ancient Near East, all the other nations, all the other city-states, they're, for the most part, they're all kind of running back to their corners to rest. Egypt has always been a contender in that region up to this time. Egypt's always been a nation to be afraid of, but during this particular period of time, Egypt's got some weak kings. They're not really a threat right now, so they're just kind of chilling, and they're not really doing anything. Assyria is going to become the Assyrian Empire. They're going to be an empire that's going to take over the world shortly, but they're not quite there yet. They're just kind of rising to power. They're not quite there yet. They are, however, strong enough to beat up on some of the other countries in the area that like to come down and give Israel trouble. Countries like Aram, Damascus, some of these other little kingdoms, some of these city-states. So they actually got together and were trying to beat Assyria because they were scared that Assyria was going to get too strong. Assyria kind of whoops them. They run back with their tails between their legs. They're kind of in their corners now, not doing much. Assyria's over here. They're getting somewhere. They're going to be powerful within a couple of generations. They're not quite there yet. So all of a sudden, there's this moment in history where nobody's really bothering Israel. They're just kind of chilling right in the middle, and nobody is really giving them trouble. For the first time in a long time, Israel is able to kind of take their breath and start asking questions. Like, hey, what can we do with our time? And so what happens? Well, the economy starts booming. People start focusing on like just living for themselves. People start getting really rich. Business is thriving. The economy's thriving. Prosperity. All of this stuff's going on. And with all of that comes what always comes when people start getting really comfortable. And that's complacency. They get complacent. All of a sudden, there's moral decay. All of a sudden, because people get a little too comfortable. Oh, we're making all this money. I'd like to have some more of that money. So, if I have to cut corners, if I have to cheat a little bit, if I have to oppress a few people to get more money, well, I'm going to do that. So these merchants, these businessmen, they start taking advantage of people. Sexual promiscuity is on the rise because everybody's like, let's party. All of these things are going on. Their social injustice is on the rise because nobody cares anymore because everybody's comfortable. I'm sitting on my sofa. I'm comfortable. I'm pampered. I don't care what's going on in the world. And so they start turning a blind eye to injustice. And just the moral decay is everywhere. And as I'm reading this, I start asking a really weird question. And the question is, am I still reading about Israel in 760 BC? Or am I reading about the United States of America in 2026? All of a sudden, I'm asking like, we're pretty affluent. We've got a lot of comforts and luxuries. We've got a lot of good things going on. It's easy to sit on our sofa. And he actually uses that language, by the way. People sitting on their sofas pampering themselves. It's easy. We can sit on our sofas and pamper ourselves and find something to watch and turn a blind eye to everything going on outside. We do all of these things now. We have luxury on top of luxury on top. We have so much luxury and convenience at our disposal that we have forgotten that the luxuries and the conveniences at our disposal are actually luxuries and conveniences. We now think they're necessities. That is how good we have it. We have it really, really good. I know everybody's life isn't perfect. I know we all go through hardships. I know all of that. But folks, every single person in this room lives better. I don't have the exact statistics, so I'm just going to make it up on the spot. But I'm not far off. We live better than approximately 99.1% of all the people who have ever lived throughout the history of the world. We do. We do. And despite that fact, or maybe because of that fact, I feel like what I'm witnessing every time I go on the socials and every time I'm looking on the interwebs, there seems to be this concentrated effort to make people as disenfranchised as they possibly can be with what we have. There are a lot of people who profit off of dissatisfaction. And there's this effort. And you know who I see targeted big time with this effort? Is the younger generation. They are being targeted heavily. Like, hey, I see this all the time. Hey, you're 22. You just graduated college. Do you know that you can't afford that 10,000 square foot house you'd really like to have? Do you know you can't afford that $80,000 vehicle you feel like you should be driving? Don't you have it bad? Don't you have it so much worse than your great-grandparents did? I see that all the time. And look, don't get me wrong. I know inflation's a thing and inflation's rising faster than salaries and all that. I get that. But at the same time, I don't think they want those people, those 22-year-olds, to go actually ask their grandparents what their first house looked like. Because it wasn't some 10,000-foot monstrosity. See, I think part of the problem now is people are being told and people are coming up to believe that they should be able to start out with everything that it took their grandparents 15 and 20 years to build. And I think that's where a lot of the disenfranchisement comes from. is that right there, that dissatisfaction. But there is a targeted assault on our people to make us unhappy. We see it everywhere. Everything they can possibly do to make us unhappy, dissatisfied, to make us hate the country we live in, somebody's trying to do it. But again, we have luxury on top of luxury on top of luxury here. And I'll just prove that point. I can pick up this little magic device, this little piece of plastic that I carry around in my pocket. Do you realize that for most eras in our history of the world, I would have been burned at the stake if they would have seen me carrying this thing around? This would have looked like magic to people who came before us. They would have accused me of being a warlock if they saw some of the things I can do with this little magic piece of plastic. And I carry this thing around in my pocket, and if I chose to do this right now, I could pause the sermon. I could tell everybody, hold on a second. I'll be right back with you. I could pick up my little magic piece of plastic. I could tap the screen a few times. And before the sermon is over, there'd be a dude at that front door with all my groceries that he shopped for, or at least he went and got. And right behind him would be another dude with my coffee, piping hot from the PJs down in Westwego. And then right behind him would be another dude with takeout from any of these restaurants around here. Any of these restaurants around here. Do you know that throughout history, people actually had to go out and find their own food? And if you wanted to eat steak, I guess you just needed to find like a bull or cattle somewhere. And if you couldn't find it, you didn't eat steak. Yeah, if you wanted chicken, you had to go find a chicken. You had to do these things. Not only do Actually, I'll take it a step further. Do you know that throughout most of history, a legitimate question that people asked themselves was, is this the year I starve to death? If this is a bad year and my crops don't grow, this is the year I might starve to death. Therefore, I hope my crops grow. Has anyone in here legitimately wondered if this was the year that they starved to death? I doubt it. You might miss a meal. It might feel like it. If you're not when you're hungry, you might need to go get a snack. But none of us have ever been in any real danger of starving to death. Not only are we never going to probably have to worry about that, but I don't even have to go find my own food. I'm not limited to what I can hunt. I can get Mexican, Italian, Chinese, American bistro, anything I want. Not only is it available to me, someone else will cook it for me. And then someone else is going to bring it to me. And when I'm done with all of that, I'll go walk out the front door, and there'll be another dude sitting in a car waiting to take me wherever I want to go with an Uber light in the front windshield. We don't have it good. We've got it pretty good. We have luxury on top of luxury, so much so that we feel cheated if somebody takes one of those luxuries away for even a second. That Wi-Fi goes down. The universe is conspiring against me. However, will I scroll TikTok now? By the way, I'm not on TikTok, but I'm just using that as an example. But we feel cheated. We feel cheated when that happens. So we've got empty religion, we've got personal influence and luxury that leads to complacency, and complacency it does, because at the same time, there's a lot of complacency in the American church, and it's because of these luxuries. We've got all this going on. I'm not sure anymore, as I'm reading Amos, if I'm reading about them or if I'm reading about America in 2026, and this is the threshold that we are stepping over as we enter into the world of Amos, a world that looks very different and yet so much like our own. And so as we start this series, please do not make the mistake of thinking that this is just old words that were spoken long ago to these other people that have nothing to do with us, because that could not be further from the truth. The situation Amos was preaching into is a situation that has so many parallels to our situation today. And the words that he spoke to them are words that still speak to us. Almost everything he is saying to them can be taken and dropped right in our laps as is, and it would still be entirely true in the exact way it was intended when it was first said. This is the book of Amos. This sermon series is going to be an assault. I'm looking at it pretty much as an assault. It is an assault against empty religion. It is an assault against cultural Christianity. It is an assault against people just going through the motions and thinking that those motions somehow equal service to God. That is what the book of Amos and what this series is going to be. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, could we please just flip open our Bibles to the Book of Amos, chapter 1. As we walk through this series, let me just tell you, we're going to cover large stretches of text at a time. I've mapped this whole thing out. I feel like this is going to be probably 8 sermons. It's not going to be a long series at all. And normally speaking, we will probably do much larger sections of text. Today, there's only 2 verses. But these 2 verses are going to set the scene for everything else. These 2 verses are going to give us the who, the what, the when, the why, all of that stuff. It's right here. And it's going to give us the theme, and it's really an encapsulation of everything else we're going to see throughout the book of Amos, believe it or not, right here in these first 2 verses. Would you read with me? The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. So as I just said, these first 2 verses are going to give us an outlook. It's an encapsulation of everything we're going to see. Verse 1 is basically the who and the what and the when. Verse 2 gives us the why. And so we see a lot here, but verse 2 also kind of gives us in a nutshell what the theme of this whole thing is going to be. And as we start digging into it, we see how it begins. He says, the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, and which he saw concerning Israel in the days of, and then we'll get to the rest later. Now, because we're probably more familiar with the New Testament and the letters of Paul and things like that, we're probably pretty familiar with the way that the biblical authors often begin their works. That they'll usually begin, at least in the New Testament, with an identification of themselves, who they are and what they do for a living. So you'll see Paul, right, the book of Ephesians. He'll open the book of Ephesians, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God to the saints in Ephesus. That kind of thing. His name and his identity, who he is. Paul, an apostle. Paul, an apostle. It's not just Paul, it's a bunch of the New Testament letters, but we kind of see that pattern there. Well, we see the same pattern here, but there's a pretty big difference. He does identify himself, the words of Amos, but then he goes on to say who was among the shepherds. He doesn't, Paul, when he speaks, he says, Paul, an apostle. I'm an apostle of the Lord. I have this ministry of the Lord, and that's what I do, and that's who I am. Amos is not that thing. Amos was from among the shepherds. He was from among the shepherds. And even that word's a little misleading because the common word for shepherd here that would indicate somebody who goes out and tends sheep is not the word he actually uses. This is a far more rare word that only occurs twice in the Old Testament. And what it really refers to is a keeper of herds, somebody who owns and cares for herds. So, in other words, this guy, he's not just the guy that would be out in the field with the staff watching sheep. He's a businessman who owns a lot of animals. The word can mean like a herdsman or a breeder of animals, but the idea here is he owns multiple flocks more than likely. He's probably a little more well-to-do. He's a businessman. In Amos chapter 7, somebody's going to challenge him to his face and be like, hey man, you prophet, get out of here. We don't want your kind around here. And he's going to say, well, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I was a herdsman. And he even adds another wrinkle to it, a tender of sycamore figs, which indicates because there are no sycamore fig trees in Tekoa where he's from, so he probably traveled a lot too. So he has 2 jobs. He's a herdsman, and he also goes and he tends to these sycamore trees, which he would have to travel to do. So he travels for work. He travels, but this is a businessman, more than likely, and a fairly wealthy one, which is interesting because the people that he's going to be chastising for a big part of this book are people just like him. people who are a little bit more well-to-do, people who are businessy and all that kind of stuff, who are oppressing people. So it's all of these things, but I say all that to say he's not a professional minister. That's the point. Paul was in the ministry from like the time he was knee high. Paul was raised to be in that type in a ministry position. This guy was not. This guy had a secular job, like each and every one of us in here, and also like myself, who also has a regular secular job outside of this church. He was not. When he argues with that guy in Amos 7, he's quick to point out, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, meaning I was not raised for this. I did not even know I was going to be called to this until the day God called me to it, which is something I can relate to. Because I didn't know I was supposed to be a pastor until basically I was a pastor. Like that's how that worked in my life. But I can relate to this. So he wasn't like coming up expecting God to use him in this way. He was a businessman doing his job. God got a hold of him one day. God said, this is who you are now, and I'm going to give you this assignment. You're going to go do this thing. But he's not a professional minister of any type. And this is something like every single book I looked at, every commentary, everybody parks on this because this is so important for us to understand. This speaks directly to us simply for no other reason than the fact that we have to break down this wall. And I try to come back to this every single time that it comes up. And I don't necessarily think it's a problem in this church, but I want to keep guarding against it so that it never becomes a problem in this church. But there is this wall in cultural Christianity that basically, it's an invisible wall, and it's right here. It's right here. And on this side of it, there's the stage and all the people who come up on the stage. And then on this side of it, there's everybody who sits in the seats. And the way that this wall works is the people on that side who are over here, well, they're the professionals. They're the ones who do the ministry. They're the ones who do the actual service to God and all this. On this side of the wall, we're the spectators who show up to watch them do it. And like I said, I haven't caught a whole lot of that here. But I will never stop talking about it because let it never be said of this church that we ever devolve into that. And if there's anybody in here who's thinking that way, even unconsciously, we need to start challenging those thoughts, because Paul tells us in Ephesians that one of the primary jobs of the people on this side of the wall is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. The wall shouldn't even be here, and we should all be engaged in ministry. All of us. We're all ministers, believe it or not. Some of us get paid to minister, but we're all ministers. We're all ministers in one way, shape, or form. Minister doesn't mean you're a paid pastor. I'll say this too, because I'll take every opportunity to say this to you. Ministry does not need to be a scary word. Ministry is not that thing that the priests and the pastors do. Ministry is any service that you render to the church or to anybody else in the name of Jesus for the glory of Jesus. As you are being called to be used by Jesus and you are doing the things he's calling you to do, that is ministry. All right? The Gretna Food Bank, they're short on men's underwear right now. We've been talking about that for weeks. We've done a great job collecting men's underwear because we support Gretna Food Bank. And every time they tell us, hey, these are the things we need, we try to rise to the challenge. Every pair of underwear you've brought in is ministry, because that is something we are doing, a service we are providing for other people to benefit them in the name of Jesus for the glory of Jesus. They know where these items are coming from. That's a type of ministry. Ministry does not have to look one certain way. Ministry can look any of 1,000 different ways. Standing behind a pulpit preaching the gospel is not the only type of ministry. So we need to just make sure that wall never comes up, and that we remember, like we do see with Amos, who did not come out of a seminary, was not raised as the son of a prophet. It was not in his family lineage. But when God called him and God gave him an assignment, he did what God called him to do. And that right there is the key to the whole thing. Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa. Tekoa is a village about 10 miles south of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom of Judah, but he goes and he preaches in Israel. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute, but he actually has to travel to go do the job that God called him to do. He didn't get to stay where he was. You can kind of look at him in a way as like a missionary almost, because he had to leave where he was from to go minister where God was calling him to go. And so so that's Amos, that's the who. And then we keep moving along, and he says, which he saw. So notice this too. In verse 1, we have words and visions. The words of Amos, but then he says, which he saw. This book is going to contain both words and visions. Chapters 1 through 6, there's going to be a lot of what we call oracles, messages from God, words from God. Chapters 7, 8, and 9, visions from God. We're going to see both. So the verse 1 even kind of gives us the structure of the book. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So this answers the when. We got the who, we got the what. This answers the when. And some of you may have even been wondering as I read that, like, why 2 kings? Why are there 2 kings that he's referencing? And what's this about the earthquake? Well, to really understand that, we have to talk a little bit about the history of Israel. And I'll say this as well. One of these nice little topic request forms I got back for the sermons was a request that we would explore in a little more detail the history of Israel. From the time of Abraham upwards to, like more modern times. And so to the person who submitted that, here's your moment. Because I knew as I saw that, I said, I know the perfect sermon where that's going to go, because I already needed to cover it in this sermon. So to understand why we're talking about 2 kings and what's this deal, we'll get to the earthquake in a second. But why are there 2 kings? Why are there 2 kings? So we need to understand a little bit about the history of Israel. Make sure we're all on the same page. All right, so what we're going to do right here is a quick crash course in Old Testament history. All right, going all the way back to the book of Genesis, and in about 3 hours, we're going to get to 2 Kings, and which is going to push back the leadership meeting, which we're having after church, but I'll suffer for the team on that one and make you suffer with me. I will not suffer. I love this stuff. But, all right, so all joking aside, this is a quick crash course in, like, history of Israel 101, basically. So if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, and we're going to pick up with Abraham, there's this guy named Abraham. Our students, at our last youth night in April, we parked on Abraham. That was our message for the night. We learned a lot about Abraham. So some of this will be refresher for them. But Abraham was a guy who, like Amos, was called to leave the place where he was born and raised and go to another place. God said, you know what, pick up and leave, go to the land I'll show you. And along the way, he makes some promises to Abraham. He tells him things like, even though you're 80 years old and you have no kids, nevertheless, not only will you have descendants, but go count the stars if you can. Go count the sands of the shore if you can. And your descendants, if you can count them, if you can count those things, will be more numerous than that. And so God started making these promises to Abraham that he was going to have descendants, and those descendants were going to be numerous. He said, I'm going to make a great nation out of your descendants. I will raise them up into a great nation. Whoever blesses them, I will bless. Whoever curses them, I will curse. And all the people of the world will be blessed through your seed, were some of the promises he made to Abraham. And to Abraham's credit, the text tells us Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. He believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So Abraham went on from there. Abraham did, in fact, have the promised son. He had another son first. That's another topic for another day. But he had the promised son. That son's name was Isaac, the child of promise. God reaffirmed those promises to Isaac. He reaffirmed all the same promises to Isaac. Isaac then went and had some sons of his own, Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the chosen son through whom that promise was going to be fulfilled, not Esau. It was Jacob. And then God reaffirmed those promises again, this time to Jacob. This is the 3rd generation now. God made this promise. It took 3 generations for it to really kick in because God's on a different timetable. But he reaffirmed the promise to Jacob. He changed Jacob's name to Israel. And then Israel, formerly Jacob, FKA Jacob, Israel had A whole bunch of sons. 12 to be exact. And then, and I'm going to really skip some time here, those 12 sons all ended up in Egypt. They all ended up in Egypt, where 400 years went by. And those 12 sons and their families multiplied and reproduced and became what we now know today. And I'm simplifying this a little bit because there's some half tribes in there and all this other stuff. But in a very broad, simplistic outlook, those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel, them and their descendants. Each one of those family lines became a different tribe. We had the tribe of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all those tribes of Israel we talk about. So now there's 12 tribes that make up the nation of Israel, who is enslaved at this time in Egypt. So 400 years have gone by. All kind of stuff went on. The Pharaoh enslaved them. They're enslaved now. We get to the book of Exodus. God raises up Moses. Moses leads the people out of Egypt. He guides them. They go through the wilderness and all the stuff we read about throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I'm skipping a lot here, but I'm basically summarizing is what I'm doing. But so Moses leads those people out, but it's not until the book of Joshua that they're able to actually enter into that promised land that God had promised to Abraham back in the day. In the book of Joshua, after Moses dies, Joshua becomes the new leader, and that's when they're finally able to go into the promised land with these 12 tribes. They go in, and those last two sermons I did right before Mother's Day, the ethics of conquest, that's what we were talking about in those two sermons, was the Canaanite conquest. That was what was going on there. They went into Canaan as God told them to do. They settled there. They pushed out or pushed out most of the Canaanites that were living there and set up their own little space that God called them to do. So the problem with that was once they kind of got settled there, and this is the thing I was talking about earlier, they got settled there, they kicked their feet up, they got a little comfortable. Guess what? Sin. Every time people get comfortable, maybe we need to stop sitting down. Maybe we need to take the pews out. Maybe you need to stand up to listen. Maybe when you go home, you need to take all the seats out of your house. Everybody at my work now stands up at their computers. We all have those fancy desks that go up. Everybody's standing up now. Maybe we just need to not be so comfortable, but everybody got comfortable. And then they started sinning. And then as soon as they started sinning, guess what happens? The protection of God, it kind of goes away. And next thing you know, some nation comes in and says, ooh, I want that land. They come in, they take over. Israel ends up enslaved again. They start going, oh no, what have we done? We need to fix this. And they cry out to God. They repent, they cry out to God. God says, all right, I'm going to save you. He raises up what we call a judge. That's the book of Judges, a deliverer, somebody that frees the people. And now they're free again. They're great. And then they get comfortable. And then you know what happens? Sin. And around and around and around we go. That's the book of Judges. Over and over. I'd say it's a spiral, but it's not a spiral. Because every time they go around, things actually get worse. They get worse. If anything, it's a toilet. Okay, every time they're going around, they go lower and lower and lower. By the end of the book of Judges, it is a mess. There is some sick stuff in the book of Judges that those people were doing. But so now we've kind of established this pattern that the people of God, when they get too comfortable, they're gonna start doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. So we moved from Judges into 1 Samuel, and we talked about Samuel last week in the Mother's Day sermon. We talked about him in that second point when we talked about Hannah and her prayer and how Eli the priest thought she was drunk. Remember that? Well, Samuel, that was the baby that she was praying for. Samuel comes on the scene, the last of the judges, the kingmaker, and this was an important point in Israel's history, because this was the point when, okay, great, we came out the period of the judges, but then they start looking around. And they're like, those guys over there have a king. Those guys over there have a king. Why don't we have a king? I want a king. Give me a king. If I can just preach a separate sermon for 1 second, please be careful when you start looking at the secular world and being envious of the things they seem to have, that they seem to like so much. Generally not something you want to do is envy that. Okay, so that sermon's over. We'll come back over here. So they want what everybody else has. Give me a king. Give me a king. And I've talked about this recently as well. All of these sermons that we just had are coming together right here in this moment. But you remember recently we were talking about mistakes and how when you're dead set on making a mistake, God's not necessarily going to come in and stop you from making that mistake. He's going to, if you're determined to make that mistake, a lot of times he's going to say, all right, make the mistake, see how that works out for you. Well, you would expect, if you didn't know this, that God might have intervened and said, no, you're not having a king. God said, they want a king? Give them a king. Let's see how this works out. So Samuel crowns the first king, Saul. That worked out terribly. But after Saul comes David. He did a couple of things. After David comes Solomon the wise. He's so wise. He did everything right. Up until he married those thousands of pagan women. But then things really fell apart. So many jokes, not enough time. Those pagan women. So that's when things really fall apart. All of a sudden, he's not so wise anymore. He starts doing like wacky stuff. One of the things he did was this like forced labor project. He started like recruiting people against their will to help with his like building projects. And in the middle of that, Solomon dies. His son Rehoboam takes the throne. The first thing everybody wants to know is about that building project. Can we like be done with that now? Because we don't like it. Rehoboam says, all right, let me go check with some guys. So he goes over to his advisors, the guys who advised Solomon, the older gentlemen, the wise and aware gentlemen who had wisdom on him. And he says, what should I do about this? They say, get rid of it. Get rid of it. It's not good. It was never good. And they will love you for getting rid of it. Thanks for the suggestion. Now I'm going to go talk to my friends. See what they have to say. Hey, what do y'all think about this? They're like, no, man. You don't need to get rid of it. You need to double down. They don't respect you enough. So he's like, all right. So who do you think he listened to? The friends or the wise people? He listened to the friends. Hey, youth, there's another lesson for you. Don't listen to your friends. Listen to the people who know. So he does that. He goes back to the people and he says, nope, I'm not getting rid of it. I'm doubling down. They're like, oh, no, you're not, because we're out. And at that moment, remember, there's 12 tribes. The 10 tribes, the northern 10 tribes, actually break away. And they say, we're done with you. We're going to form our own kingdom. So they break away. They form what we now call the northern kingdom of Israel. They're the northern kingdom of Israel. The two southern tribes that are left over, they become what we call the southern tribe of Judah. The southern kingdom of Judah. So now there's two kingdoms, okay? What started out as one nation is now two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom of Israel. There's the southern kingdom of Judah. And from the beginning, there's problems, there's strife, there's civil war off and on, all of this. The northern kingdom, because Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. That's where the temple is. So the northern kingdom's like, well, we're not going to go to Jerusalem to worship, so we need to kind of set up our own thing. So they kind of basically set up their own religion, in a sense. It starts out okay, I guess, but since they're basically creating their own religion that worships differently, they dissolve. Like they immediately devolve, not dissolve, they devolve. They devolve into all kinds of just issues. So they fall into just rampant sin almost immediately. Almost immediately. And this moment in history right here, this is the moment when Amos comes on the scene. When these two kingdoms have split and things are going really bad. This is the moment God tells Amos, I need you to go leave your home in Tekoa, go up to Israel, give them a message for me. I need you to take this down and run it over to Israel. And that's the moment. Because what's happening now is they're right back in that place that they kept finding themselves in the book of Judges. The protection of God has been lifted, and if they don't straighten up, it's gonna crumble. So this is around 763 BC, approximately. And in 722 BC, 40 years later, well, let me spoil the whole thing. They don't listen. In 722 BC, Assyria, finally the megapower that they were going to be, they come in and they just tear the whole thing down. They destroy the northern kingdom. It ceases to exist. They take all the people into exile. Just take them. They're gone. The kingdom of Israel ceases to exist. Never has it returned. Not in that format. The southern kingdom of Judah, they keep chugging along for about 150 more years. And then Assyria, because world empires, they come, they go. God is forever. Assyria falls to Babylon. Babylon becomes the dominant empire. Babylon comes in and conquers Judah. Does the exact same thing to them. Destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, hauls the people off into exile, and they cease to exist as a separate kingdom. So now they ain't there no more. They're just gone. So Babylon rules for a little while, then Babylon falls, and they're replaced by the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, they did something pretty cool, and they said, hey, if some of y'all want to go home, y'all can go home. And so slowly but surely, people start trickling back in and rebuilding and repopulating, and that's what we see in the books of like Ezra, Nehemiah, and actually Esther takes place during that time frame too. If some of you, Esther is a favorite book of mine. I know it's a big favorite for a lot of the ladies. Esther takes place during that period because that's why she's in Persia. If you read that, they're not in Israel; they're in Persia, and that's a Persian king that she's interacting with. But in a nutshell, that's what's going on in Israel during this whole time frame. And that moment in time, when the kingdoms are split, that's the period of time when God calls Amos to go deliver this message to the people. And that's why there's two kings. That's why there's Uzziah in the north and Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam in the north. That's why there's two kings. And so what they're doing there, the reason he's giving us that information is because I don't know if this might be new information for some people in here, but if you would have gone to them in 763 BC and asked what year is it, they would not have said 763 BC. They were not aware of that calendar yet, that had not been invented. They would have been like, well, let's see, Jesus will not be born for another 763 years. Therefore, this is 763 BC. They did not have that awareness. They used something called relative dating, where they would date things according to other things that everybody knew when it happened. And so that's why one of their favorites was according to who was the king at the time. So they say, while Jeroboam was the king in Israel and Uzziah was the king in Judah, which gives us a range of about 790 to about 710 BC. Somewhere, that's where the overlap is. But then he gives us a third piece of information. 2 years before the earthquake. And I think that's what helps us narrow it down a little bit more to just somewhere between 790 and 710. Have you ever noticed how you'll hear people say things like, and don't say no, because the answer is yes, how that was like a year before COVID. That was like the year after COVID, that kind of thing. Like, why didn't you just say 2019? Well, because we all know when COVID happened. And that's a reference point for a lot of us, is like that moment right there. Same thing with Hurricane Katrina. Same thing with 9/11. We'll say, oh yeah, that was right before Katrina. Things like that. That's called relative dating. We're dating things according to other things that we expect everybody else just kind of knows when that is. So he says 2 years before the earthquake. Apparently this earthquake was a big enough deal that everybody knew what he was talking about. So this big earthquake. Now, would you do me a favor real quick? Let's flip over to, there's not a slide for this, so you're going to have to look at your Bible if you're going to look at it. This is Amos chapter 8, verses 7 and 9. This is kind of how we can maybe help narrow this down a little bit. In Amos chapter 8, verses 7, 8, and 9, during one of Amos's visions, look what he says. He says, "The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about and sink again like the Nile of Egypt?" Doesn't that sound a little bit like an earthquake? The land moving, the land rising, the land falling. It sure sounds like he's prophesying an earthquake that's about to happen. But one verse further down in verse 9, watch this. "And on that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." What does that sound like? Sure sounds like an eclipse, right? Like the sun is going to go down in the middle of the day, darkness is going to spread. So during this vision, Amos is talking about these two events that apparently are going to happen very close together. This earthquake, this big earthquake, and this, which sure sounds to us today like a solar eclipse. Although to them, they just heard, oh, it's going to go dark in the middle of the day. So these two events are going to happen roughly around the same time. Here's where this gets really neat, because I'm also a big fan. I'm becoming an increasingly huge fan of biblical archaeology. This is where this gets really neat, because do you know that an Israeli archaeologist in the 1950s and 60s excavating the city of Hazor in Israel found evidence of a major earthquake in the archaeological record that he dated, independently of this story, by the way. He dated it. It looks like this took place somewhere between 765 and 760 BC. Just based on the archaeological data, we found evidence of this big earthquake. Okay, so let's put a pin in that. Something else that fascinates me is astronomy, but I don't have time to get into that. But what I am continuing to be fascinated by is how astronomers and like scientists can like discover a meteor like way out past Pluto somewhere, whether you agree that that's a planet or not, but way out past Pluto somewhere, and say, oh, that's going to reach the Earth in 2063 on May 1st, and it's going to pass within this amount of miles, and they're right. That fascinates me like nobody's business. But also the fact that they can go back and look at things that have already happened and tell us that. Well, we also know that on June 15th, 763 BC, there was a solar eclipse in Israel a solar eclipse. It wasn't in Israel, but there was a solar eclipse that was visible in Israel on that day at that time, right in the middle of the 765 to 760 range that we think this archaeologist dated this earthquake. So we have evidence from archaeology and from I guess that's astronomy of these two events coalescing at 763 that Amos told us ahead of time were going to occur at about the same time. And for one thing, the Bible's true, and so I love when science comes along and says, and backs up the things that we already knew. But we see here this event that could very well be what Amos was talking about in Amos chapter 8. It may not be. It may not be. Unless maybe there was some other day that an earthquake and a solar eclipse happened at the same time. I don't know. But this kind of helps us narrow this down to 763 BC. And that's just kind of what I'm going with, which means Amos is prophesying about 40 years before Israel is going to collapse. And what is it that Amos is out here telling these people? But if you don't get this right, it's going to all collapse. God is speaking, the people aren't listening. That's the problem. Does that also sound like something we could take and apply to America in 2026? God is always speaking. Are we listening? One of the central themes in all the prophets, one of the, basically when you break down what their mission is, every single one of them, these are God's covenant people, and their covenant God is reminding them of the covenant they made with God and telling them, you need to get back to honoring this covenant, because that covenant, kind of like common grace, is the only reason you're still here. Once that covenant comes off the table, you're all in a lot of trouble. You need to get back to honoring this covenant. And for hundreds of years, God tried and he tried and he tried to get through to him, but the people just weren't listening. Here's a quote from one of my books that I wanted to share with you that says, the enduring principle here, meaning just in the book of Amos, is that every message based on the Bible has its origin with the covenant God and has as its intended audience the people of God. Now this next line, this is the one I really want to draw your mind to. Only people in covenant with God are attuned to hear the message of God. Ideally, when God speaks, covenant people listen. And so we're going to walk through this book now for 8 weeks. I'm done here. Don't worry. I'm done. But we're going to walk through this book now for 7 more weeks. There's going to be about 8 sermons total. And that is going to be something that we're just going to keep coming back to. God is still speaking. Are we listening? God still has things to say to us through Amos and through all kind of other channels. Are we listening? When God speaks, covenant people listen. That's going to be my question. And that's what I'm going to leave you with here today. God is speaking. Are you listening? And as we walk through these next few messages and we see all the different ways God tried to get their attention, I'm going to look out and I'm going to say, how is God trying to get your attention? What has God sent into your life to try to get your attention and to try to let you know, I still have my eyes on you and I have a message for you. Are you listening to me? Because God, if I've learned anything, He never stops delivering the goods. We sometimes put Him on do not disturb, but He never stops reaching out. He never stops trying from His end. Are you listening?